Thanks for joining us on Wellness Talk Radio. I'm Chris Costello, and today we are so honored to have Gail Sheehy, world-renowned author of 15 books, including 3 years on the New York Times best-selling list, Passages. She was one of the original contributors to New York Magazine, and also the 7-time recipient of the New York Newswomen's Club Front Page Award for Journalism. Gail, it is such an honor to have you with us today.
Oh, thank you, Chris, for having me. I just came back from Southern California. I was doing a talk for a Motion Picture Television Fund, and lots of caregivers and social workers and care managers in the audience, and boy, it's just something you just feel so good because people soak it up. It's such a hard role, and just to have anybody to make some sense of it seems to be very well received.
Right, and so today we're going to be talking about your new book, Passages in Caregiving, Turning Chaos into Confidence. This is such a moving story, and it's the story of your 17 years of caregiving for your husband, Clay Felker, who was quite a personality, New York editor, and just a mentor to so many famous and wonderful writers. And I want to start, if we can, just with that love story and what it was like to go through this for you.
Well, it started with a phone call I received in a beauty salon where I was having my hair done to go to a concert with my husband that night. And he was still, a very strong editor. We had a wonderful circle of colleagues, writers, editors, artists, photographers, and we were going to a concert with friends. My career was doing well. I'd already done about 12 books. And I got a phone call, and it was from a doctor I hardly recognized. My husband's oncologist from 2 years ago. He said, "It's not benign." I said, "What?" The cyst I took out on Mr. Felker's neck 2 years ago. It's cancer. Well, we started off 2 years behind the 8 ball, and with something we'd never faced. I never imagined it. I wasn't prepared for it. Most of us aren't. I certainly wasn't trained to be a caregiver. I didn't know the lingo. It was like being dropped into a foreign country without, the currency or the visa. My husband gave me the first clue as to how we were going to respond. I didn't know what to say when I went home to see him, how he would react, but, I let him set the tone, and he just said, "We're going to the concert. We'll get through this together." So that's how we started.
And that must have been such a shock to, out of the blue to have that, to get that news. And unfortunately, I think that's how that happens for many of us when a loved one becomes ill or has a crisis.
Yes, life changes on a dime. And then you realize that your life has changed radically too. And you have a new role. Although most people, and most women are the caregivers, don't think of themselves as caregivers. That's the first hurdle. They just say, "This is what we do." But it's a professional level role today. You're taking the place of, somebody that has been seen by maybe 24 people in the course of 24 hours in a hospital. And now you're trying to do it all on your own, and you may have a child or children still at home and work outside the home, like the average caregiver. It's overwhelming.
Right. You said the average person is in their 40s, 50s, has kids, and is working, that is also caring for a loved one. One of the things that was just so wonderful about Passages in Caregiving was the way you wove the personal story of your own personal journey with caring for your husband, Clay, with just some real nuts and bolts information about what to do and how to get through all of this. And so I want to really try and give people as much information as we can. What do they do when they first get that news? What's the best thing to do?
I think the first thing to do is to, take the measure of how your loved one wants to deal with it. And if it's not a healthy way, try to suggest a healthier way or get them some support so they don't remain in denial. One of you has to be not in denial. And if it's a caregiver, I said you have to become a good reporter. Take a tape recorder into the important consults with doctors because you'll be likely to be seeing more than one doctor, and they differ in their approach. Sometimes they differ in their diagnosis, and you can get lost. So eventually you pick the doctor that you trust the most. Don't rush into a treatment right away. Gather a lot of information. And then ask that doctor 3 key questions. See whether he or she will be your medical quarterback, help you call the plays. You ask, will you help us select from the care alternatives and give us the pros and cons? Will you help us assemble the care team and keep in touch with the other doctors and other care professionals? And will you address the pain or other symptoms that might come from the treatment? And if they will agree to 2 or 3 of those, you've got yourself a medical quarterback, and the game is going to be much easier to play. Well, and then the next thing is to get your siblings or other family members on board, because nobody can do this alone. It's just not possible. You will eventually, wear yourself out, and when the caregiver gets sick, there's just nobody left to take up the role. So I say have the conversation with your parents before the crisis. Mom, Dad, if something were to happen, we were to get a call, how would you like it to be handled? What's your view of what you'd like done and how you'd like it done? And who you'd like doing it. How can we get everybody in the family involved? And then call your brothers and sisters together and see, let's all say what I can do best. Maybe one has a very high energy job and doesn't have time to fly in, but might have enough money to get the airfare paid for another member of the family who is retired and might be willing to spend some time visiting Mom and Dad, so that it doesn't all fall on one person. Because if it does, eventually that one person, who's probably always taken the major responsibility in the family, will probably start playing God and thinking that he or she has to be the one on tap all the time to save the loved one from something dire happening. And that will lead to burnout.
You talk a lot in Passages in Caregiving about the circle of care, and it sounds like there are some resources out there. Where do people go to get support for that, to create that circle of care?
Well, first you turn to, if you're taking care of your parents and they live distant, their neighbors. The person that Dad sees at the VFW or Mom plays bridge with or they, used to work with, or the pharmacist who fills their prescriptions, all of whom can be your eyes on the family when you're not there. And then there's the Area Agency on Aging, which is in every county in the country, the state, federal agency, and they have a care manager who can assess the needs of the family at home and recommend local resources. But you have to stay on their case. You have to call them back and back when things don't work out or you get a wrong number. But they are generally very helpful. Then you would need to find out if your loved one is on Medicare. What will they provide? It's very little for chronic illness. Medicare doesn't help with long-term care at home, only a few weeks. And Medicaid, for people who are not necessarily poor, you could be middle class. If you have an income under $45,000, you may be able to get Medicaid, and that will allow you to some waiver programs that might help caring for somebody at home or taking them to a central location under the PACE program and letting them see all their doctors in one place and have a social experience. But more than anything, I think you, the caregiver, have to make time to get away yourself. You absolutely have to get away for a weekend now and then, and for at least an hour or two every single day to do something pleasurable for yourself, to interrupt the hypervigilance cycle that just keeps spewing out stress hormones until you pretty much deplete your immune system and you're liable to get sick yourself.
We're talking with Gail Sheehy, author of Passages in Caregiving. You're listening to Wellness Talk Radio. And now, Gail, another thing that really came to mind in reading Passages in Caregiving, as a society, I think this applies also to, there's lots of parents out there, the rates of autism and learning disabilities are really increasing. So we have that same kind of stress going on for parents, where they just have that caregiving. And I think that your point is so important about taking time for yourself, taking a break, making sure that you recharge those batteries.
Yes, exactly. And there's another 15 million Americans taking care of disabled children. Then you put it all together, the caregiver is taking care of somebody who isn't totally independent. It's 65 million. So it's a huge portion of our population, and yet there's very little help, governmental and not too much community help, for people taking care of chronically ill persons at home. One thing that I didn't get to put in the book because I just found it recently, helps for people who are caregiving long distance, which is what most of people do. And that is what we're always afraid of with an older person is that they're going to fall, because we know that leads to a very bad cascade. And so there's this new system out there called WellCore, which is an automatic fall detection system, and it's pretty cool. It looks like a pedometer that can just fit on a belt or on a jacket, as opposed to a pendant that looks like, oh my God, I'm just a frail older adult. This looks like a piece of jewelry, But it has sensors in it that can detect the motion between 27 different falls. So it beams right to a emergency call center help if it's needed.
And that really, I would imagine, would take some of the worry out of that long-distance caregiving.
Yeah, well, it also sends a message to the caregivers. Anybody who's on your private web system will get that message. And also, it sends messages about just the daily activity pattern of your parents. So are they walking well as much as they say they are? Or are they, couch potatoing and giving you blowing in your ear?
Right, and people can look that up at wellcore.com?
Yeah, WELLCORE.com.
Great.
It'll be sold in a major electronics store by the end of the summer, I understand. But the other thing is it builds a bond between the caregiver who lives at a distance and mom or dad or another loved one, family member, because it has an audio unit that allows the caregivers to just send lovely voice messages on a day-to-day basis, that it's easy for the person to push one button and hear and feel cared for.
And I know another thing you mentioned, Gail, was the internet and just the power of now we have all these webcams and,
Right.
It's just kind of a way to stay connected.
Oh, definitely. Using the webcams and there are other easy systems that operate where the person who isn't savvy with a computer can send faxes or emails or messages, write little notes and just send them in like a copy machine. Low-tech stuff that allows for the connection to be more robust.
The other thing in Passages in Caregiving that you talk about a lot is the significance of the labyrinth. How does that, it's throughout the whole book, and what did that mean to you when you went through this?
Well, when I wrote Passages, and I was in my 30s then, and I was parsing the stages of adulthood, they fell into nice, neat sequences that, had the normal ages that one would be in that passage, and then a long stage that would follow. Then you'd wrap up the task of that stage, then you'd move into another passage. It was all very linear. But caregiving wasn't anything like that. And I couldn't figure out for the longest time how to write about it, to let you know what are the emotional turning points on this long path. One day I was at a retreat for caregivers, and I was walking a labyrinth, which is a circular path, and it leads to the center, and then it leads back out. It's one continuous path, unlike a maze, which has many paths meant to confuse you. But a labyrinth, if you have patience and faith, you will come to the center and you will come out. However, you can't see ahead. You don't know where the turnings are. And they're abrupt. There's an abrupt twist, and then you're going along on a nice path, and then there's another abrupt turn. And that's just the way it is with caregiving, and it really hit me as a metaphor. And so I then was able to describe 8 common turning points on that circular labyrinth path that you need to be aware of. And you need to know how to approach them and how to change your game plan, because a different set of coping mechanisms will be called upon for these different turning points.
So with caregiving, it's almost as if the whole idea of being able to plan and having things be linear is just kind of blown out of the water.
It is,
Yeah.
but if you have this map, it'll tell you, if you read, I can't do this anymore, you'll say, oh, I'm there. That's where I am. I mean, just the phrase, people know where to go in the book to look themselves up. Or another one is the in-between stage, when you have someone with chronic illness, but they can't be cured in the hospital anymore. They refuse to go back to the emergency room, but they're not ready for hospice. So what do you do then? And then there's a whole, section on what you do, and can you afford a home care team, and or can you get on to Medicaid, or do you need a practical nurse, or how do you explore the gray market of mostly immigrant women who can be even more skilled than somebody you would get from an agency. And finally, the long goodbye, and how do you handle that, and end-of-life conversations. And what I found was palliative care, which was a godsend, to take care of my husband at home with a team from Mount Sinai Hospital, a geriatrician at the head of it who worked with me and let me know what to expect week to week, and a visiting nurse who came 2 or 3 times a week to head off emergencies so we could keep Clay at home, and a social worker, and an ecumenical spiritual counselor who was very important to help us with our end-of-life conversation.
To have that kind of team just sounds like, it made such a difficult process somewhat, can I use the word easier?
Well, yeah, it made it more comforting because they could tell you where you are on this path and where you're likely to go next, and when to, what to pay attention to. What is the patient trying to tell you that they might not be able to say? Because the hardest thing is to know when to let go and when the patient wants to let go. And they will often tell you in very subtle ways that you're not aware how to read. But the folks who've been at this for a while really know how to read them. And that can take a lot of the stress out of it. And then if one of your brothers or sisters or another, family member flies in and suddenly wants to do everything because they haven't been there, they haven't seen a slow ebbing, they haven't seen maybe the person has begun to retreat from everyday life because it's just too much work. But the person who's just dropped in doesn't know that and may want to start all over again and pull out all the stops. And you have to know that and be confident that you're being guided in the right direction by professionals who have been through this before.
And that's another thing, Gail, you talk a lot about in Passages is you had some doctors that were just phenomenal and really changed the course of what you went through, it sounds like, in a positive way.
Absolutely.
I'd love to hear more about just what can people look for? What are they going to really want in people like that?
Well, I think you want a doctor who forms, a relationship with the living person and knows something about, cares something about, and asks about who they were before they got sick. Because, there are certain doctors who stand up above and the patient is down below, and it's Dr. God talking to this poor, pathetic person in a hospital bed who just feels so powerless. But he may have been just as, strong and robust and creative as the doctor 5 years ago. And I remember my geriatrician from Mount Sinai, Dr. Morrison, always sat beneath my husband. He would get on a footstool and sit below him so that it would be doctor talking up to the patient and putting the control back in his hands to say what he wanted. And the most important two questions he asked him in our whole long goodbye phase was, what makes it worth getting up for you every morning? What do you need to maintain a quality of life that makes you want to go on living? And when Clay could spell out exactly what it was, he wanted to go out and see what's going on in the world, even if it was with a wheelchair or a walker, being a journalist. And we said, we can make that happen. And the other question he asked him is, are you afraid of dying? Well, you can't find out unless you ask. And Clay nodded his head, yes. And he said, what are you afraid of? And he said, being alone. And the doctor said, well, we can guarantee that won't happen because I'll be there and Gail will be there. And, that's not going to happen. And what else are you afraid of? I'm afraid of dying in a hospital. He said, well, we can tell you that's not going to happen because the whole idea behind palliative care is to keep the chronically ill person out of the hospital and to work on whatever symptoms or emergencies come up at home, which we can do in almost every case. And what's the third? And Clay said, I want to walk again. And Dr. Morrison had to say, well, we may not be able to get to that, but we can practice every day and make it a little better and keep your mood up and your body going to try to make it better. So once we had those things settled, it was much easier for all of us to move through the next months without false expectations or over treatment. You're not going to find it in every surgeon by any means, or even an oncologist who may be, pretty much done with you once the treatment has been administered and not interested in aftercare. But you have to ask the doctor, will you stick with us on aftercare? And if he or she says no, then say, do you have a nurse who will stick with us? And if not, try to find somebody else.
Keep looking. They're out there, right? You just have to...
They are out there, yeah.
Gail, what are some of the stories that you want to share with people about your experience? I mean, you're so honest in Passages in Caregiving, and that your stories with your husband, Clay, are so moving. What do you want people to really take from this?
Well, as your loved one becomes more restricted, it's very important to try to go out in the world and, as I say, normal is as normal does. At one point, my husband had to have a permanent feeding tube. Well, most people think that's the end of the line, but in fact, Clay had a feeding tube for 10 years because he couldn't risk eating by mouth since he was at risk for aspirating food into his lungs, which would produce pneumonia. And that's what he finally died from. But for those 10 years, if we had been sitting inside and, mixing up and blenderizing his food and pouring it through a strainer and eating at home all the time, we would have gone nuts, and he would have died much sooner. So after one semester of doing that, I said, come on, let's just, throw caution to the winds and go to Paris for a week. And he was a bit dubious, but he went along with it. And when we got over to Paris and standing at Charles de Gaulle Airport and waiting for a taxi, and Clay was leaning on me as if, he was humiliated. Don't leave me. And I thought, you must be crazy. How could I take somebody in his condition to a transatlantic trip? But, the next morning I went out to Harrods and I got lots of wonderful goodies and mixed up his meal with a blender and poured it in. And then I poured 2 cups of cafe au lait. And next thing you know, he leapt out of bed and said, let's go to the Louvre. So, it really was a curative. And then I went out that afternoon thinking we can't just sit in a hotel room at dinner time. And I went to a little French cafe, asked to see the chef, and I asked if he would, be kind enough to take the blender and French current, whip up the food, strain it, and put it in pitchers to serve to Clay so we could sit in the nice ambiance of a French restaurant with candlelight and a glass of wine and have a romantic evening. And he was, at first, he said, oh, quel dommage, your husband could never taste my exquisite cuisine, but he agreed happily, and that night he sent out 2 waiters with the silver trays and silver pitchers on top of the trays, and they stood guarding us and put us at a discreet table. And Clay smelled my rotisserie chicken and the potatoes and the vegetables, and then he poured his, and we sat there for 3 hours having the most wonderful time. I'll never forget that evening. And at the end, a couple of French couples came over to welcome us to Paris. Now, when did that happen to you as an American last time? So we had a memorable evening, and after that, we weren't afraid to go out for dinner. And we went out in cafes in Europe when we traveled there with friends. We went to friends' houses. They came to our house. All I would have to do is, see the restaurant manager or chef in the afternoon and ask if they would accommodate special needs, and they were happy to do so. Otherwise, we would have lost 10 wonderful years.
So keep living, even though there's different things shift, it sounds like, but just keep doing the things that you love and enjoy.
Yeah, and when I told that story the other night at a speaking engagement in Chicago, a man had just finished telling us he'd had cancer off and on for a few years, and he'd had a number of operations, and he was feeling really very precarious. And his wife had said to him one night as they were going to sleep, we always wanted to go to Shanghai. Would you go to Shanghai? And there was a long silence, and he said he didn't answer. He just thought he could never go to Shanghai, that maybe it was time to take hemlock. So I told my story about the French experience, and at the end of the panel, he said, I'm going to rethink Shanghai. So that was a small triumph.
That's wonderful, yes. And it is those memories. I know when my grandmother was in a nursing home, it was a terrible ordeal. And I snuck in. I was fairly young at the time. Snuck in and told them I was taking her for a walk and took her on a wonderful drive to the valley. And it was such a great memory. And those kind of memories are so important.
Oh, they are. And I also remember one time I took Clay out of the nursing home where he was getting rehab. He'd been in for a couple of months. He said, I want to go to the country. And I was so glad to hear that from him. So I rented a big SUV, and we put his oxygen tank and his wheelchair and breathing apparatus and a care aid and we drove up to the country to my daughter's house. And he sat out on a porch looking at the mountains and the trees and the fields, and he said, I forgot what beautiful was. That was worth gold.
And to have that memory. And we have been talking with Gail Sheehy, a New York Times bestselling author, and her new book, Passages in Caregiving, a phenomenal book, beautifully written love story, and just nuts and bolts on how to get through caregiving. Gail, thank you so much for being with us on Wellness Talk Radio, and this has just been wonderful talking with you.
It's been a wonderful conversation for me too, Chris. Thank you.